Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I hope you're doing well. I can see there's quite a bit of weather where almost everybody lives. So hopefully everybody is staying safe and warm. I'm going to put in the chat a link to the Safari Assur sheet as well as my website for those who are interested. As soon as Julie, you mentioned this week's Parsha and you paused, I was so concerned I'd prepared the wrong Parsha, but of course I didn't, and we are learning about Terumah. We're going to jump right in, and I'll give people a chance to share both their comments in the chat, and we'll have some time at the end to learn together. So I'm going to share my screen, it is you'll find the link in the chat, as I said before, and I'm just going to prepare my screen here for a sec. So while we do this, actually, I'm going to change my mind here before I share my screen. I'd love for anyone who is able to put a single word answer into the chat to the following prompt. What is needed for a strong relationship? And that's any kind of relationship, right? It doesn't have to be a romantic relationship. What is something needed for a strong relationship? Communication, trust, understanding, reciprocity, honesty, deep listening, love, a lot of trust. That's really interesting. Good intention, wisdom, commitment, respect, faith, time together, integrity, love, good food, very wise, time, rules, dedication, empathy. I love it. These are fantastic answers. Being able to give and take. Patience, that's a good one. There are a lot of things that we need for strong I like humor, that's wonderful. Oh, I turned off my camera, I can't believe that. There are a lot of things that are important for relationships, and you can see here, there are a lot of answers to them. All of them are right answers. And I think that's part of what we see at the beginning of this week's Parsha. And so from the very first verse here, we see the following. Right, from the beginning of the week of the Parsha. Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, daber el bnei Yisrael v'yiklu li truma me'et kol ish asher yidvenu libo tikchu et trumati. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, tell the Israelite people to bring me gifts. Right, the word gifts is a translation of the word truma, which we might argue is not quite the right translation, if you will. And you shall accept gifts for me from every person whose heart so moves them. And what we see in this Parsha, I think, is a reflection of a lot of the things that came up in the chat. Trust, reciprocity. I think to give a gift generously is something that requires trust, that it will be accepted in a similar way. And we can actually scroll down here to the comment of Sforno, who is a commentator on this in general, and his comment here on this line from Torah is the following. God commanded that the procedure, right, the giving of gifts here, should not be like an imposition of every person's contribution for the public charity fund, which is treated as a tax, right? So there is these concepts of sort of a communal pot of collection of resources that are distributed out in lots of different ways. And there's lots and lots of wonderful text both in the Gemara and other places about how that process should work. But all of that is considered an obligation, and the use of tax is sort of the reference to that. But here we're learning something very different. Contributions were to be accepted only from volunteers. So we're already learning that this is not the same as a collection. It is something that people are giving generously. And I think we'll talk about generosity at the end, but I think giving generously requires trust. Meaning to say that we are giving of ourselves with the hope and the trust that something good will happen, that it will be used in the best way possible, that it would be accepted in the intention that it is given. And so I think what's so interesting is when we pair this with another verse that might be familiar to you, which is Va'asuli mikdash, which is only 8 verses below, or 6 to 8 verses below. V'shechanti betocham. Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. This is God saying to Moses about the Israelite people, right? And let them, ba'asu, they should make me, li, a mikdash. And here it's translated as sanctuary, but we could argue what this word mikdash is, and I think we should do that a little bit. And then v'shachanti b'tocham, that we should dwell amongst them. And well, you might notice in common parlance, the word mikdash, if we scroll down a bit, I think I put it, it's the Ibn Ezra here. He comments saying the word mikdash is the word for the mishkan, the tabernacle. And he says it's a mikdash, it's holy, because it's this place that God dwells in. And so I'm going to back up one step. And you might be familiar with this song or this tune, and you'll forgive me for singing ever so briefly. And you might be familiar with the song, inspired by our verse. Oh Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary, pure and holy, tried and true, and with thanksgiving, I'll be a living sanctuary for you. I'll save all of you from singing any further, but just a quick show of hands. I'm just going to look at everybody's little face. Are people familiar with this song? Have people heard this song before? Yeah, so pretty familiar. That's wonderful. And I think part of that is that first of all, it's used in a lot of liturgy today, but also it reflects these ideas, these things that are in this verse. But I want to point out some really important assumptions in this song that we may not share. And by we, I just mean each of us individually. So here, the word mikdash, sanctuary, has all these connotations with it. Here in this song, that this mikdash is pure. It's holy. Holy and mikdash are translated together. It's tried and true. It's got experience. It is honest. And it carries with it gratitude, right? Thanksgiving, and that we would be a living sanctuary, it's being interpreted that way. And I'm not sure that I would necessarily define holiness, a mikdash, with all of these things. And as I said before, the Ibn Ezra, he just says, you know what, it's a holy place. That's where God dwells. Like, it's called, the Mishkan is just called the mikdash. It's nothing more than that, right? It's just the term that being used. Mikdash, or kadosh, and here I've pulled from the dictionary, from the Klein Dictionary, carries a number of different associations. Holiness, again, which is sort of just another word with all sorts of additional connotations. Set apart, consecrated, right? Forbidden, perhaps, right? Because it's pulled apart. We know that there are rituals and prayers using this word, right? The kiddush, the kaddish, all their sort of interpretations with these words. And so what I'd like to do, just to pause before we unpack any further, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. I'd love for people to put in the chat what resonates with you. What words or symbols, what examples do you experience when you hear the word holy or kadosh? And you can just put them in the chat. What things, when you hear the word holy or kadosh or kadesh or mikdash, what comes up for you, right? Sacred, God, set apart, right? Some of these we saw in the definition, some of that light or awe. Pure vessel, right? Very much reflecting the song. A soul, life enhancing, right? God's commandments. Intimidating or distant, that's a super interesting one. Perfect, personal love, dedication or dedicated. God here, or Hashem. Marriage, right? Kiddushin. Wonderful new life. Wholeness, something that is uncommon, deep, hard to get to. Monotheistic, that's interesting. Repentance, the indwelling by the Almighty. If that's not a definition of a mishkan, of the mikdash, I don't know what is, right? The indwelling by the Almighty. It's powerful language. Piety, peace, specialness, true to God, spiritual. There's so many. Oh my goodness. As I scroll down, there's so many. Havdalah. So I'm not going to read them all, but you can start to see that there are a lot of associations we have with holiness. And I think for us, we can understand that holiness can show up in a lot of different contexts. I think it can show up in places, right? That's what Ibn Ezra is telling us. We know that it can show up with people, right? In relationships we have with people. It can show up in actions, right? Someone used Havdalah as an example, or these rituals, these moments, these activities that we take on that are holy, right? Mitzvot are carry with them holiness. We also know that times, right, moments can be holy. And in fact, I'm going to share my screen here again. We can see that's exactly what the Midrash does for this, right? So here, the Midrash says the following, right? So quoting our verse, "Va'asuli mikdash v'shechanti b'tocham," and let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. Midrash Tanchuma says the following: on which day did God relate to Moses the portion relating to the temple? Right? This section of Torah, on what day was that in the calendar year? And the Midrash tells us it was on the Day of Atonement. It was on Yom Kippur, right? A holy day. And that was so despite the fact that the Torah portion describing the sanctuary precedes the incident of the golden calf, right? So the Midrash here is pointing out that if you look at the order of the portions, maybe there's a problem there, right? That the order of operations is somehow problematic, right? That this thing happened on a different day and we've ascribed it to a particular day in the calendar, and we've found ourselves a problem. And there's a principle that shows up in interpretation of Torah, and here it's reflected. There are a lot of people who say it. Rashi is known to have said it, but in this case, we have this comment from the Midrash. Rabbi Judah, the son of Rabbi Shalom, said, "There is actually no such thing as preceding or following in the Torah," meaning to say, the Torah is not written in a chronological order. Right, that some things might appear to be before or after, but that's not how Torah functions. And here he has a proof text, right, from the book of Proverbs: "Lest she walk the even path of life, her ways wander, but she knoweth not." Meaning to say that the arrangement of its Torah and its sections are perhaps more complex than it appears. But here he comes to the end, right? This verse refers to the arrangement of Torah and its sections, and then he concludes, "Hence, it was on the Day of Atonement that God told Moses, 'Make me a sanctuary.'" And so once again, we're getting this sense that people and places and actions and times are all rolled up together when we think about holiness. And I think, especially where we started about relationships, that holiness is a big piece of that. And we started, and so many of the examples that you all gave were that relationships require trust. And of course, if this moment we're talking about is about holiness and Yom Kippur gives us this amazing opportunity to fix broken trust. Again, of course, in the context of the temple, of this destruction of the temple that we find out much later in history, the rabbis are so concerned about how are we going to repent? How are we going to do this forgiveness work if we don't have sacrifices in which to do it? And I think Yom Kippur and this section offers us an invitation, a rethinking of how we can do that, right? We have new rituals that came with it. We have fasting, and we beat our chest, all sorts of things around forgiveness and repentance. And here, I think we can learn something as well. And so I think when we're in the position of rebuilding and reconnecting and building relationships even for the first time, we think about the ways we do that. We often offer gifts, or some sort of way to show that we care about someone. My wife always comes home from the grocery store and says, "I bought you something delicious from the grocery store." That's one of the ways that she shows her love for me is buying delicious, usually chocolate and peanut butter food for me from the grocery store. But I want to offer something I read in an article yesterday, which might be a sideways turn for some of you. And I tried to get the picture because the picture was so cool, but I'll scroll up to the headline, which is this article about quantum physics. And look, I'm no expert in quantum physics, so I will give you the shortest possible description of the problem and how they solved it, which is to say that quantum theory has a problem, which is that in its calculations, the way it functions, it presumes a single observer, right? As if there's only one person in the universe who's experiencing it. But of course, that's a problem because we are all experiencing the universe at the same time. And so the question is, how do we resolve that? And it so struck me, the last line. So they had this whole thing about how they would do it and the math, and you can go look up the article if you want. Do we create space-time? And that's kind of a spoiler because the last sentence is the following: perhaps this calculation that they have is telling us that until two people interact, they don't share the same reality. because it is communication itself that creates it, which is to say reality. Meaning to say, according to this theory, this argument in quantum physics, our interactions with other people, with the things around us, creates reality in its first place, which is just a mind-bending concept in the first place. And I think this is supported in Torah. And I'll offer a few examples. Here we have one of the, I think, most known verses in all of Torah. It's the third verse from the Torah. It's about creation. Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or Vayi Or. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. God's spoken word, interaction with the universe, created the universe. And we can see as we dig a little deeper, this wonderful text, a Hasidic text, that comments on our original verse and brings in this idea of the creation of the universe for speech. My dear friend and colleague, Rabbi Adir Yolka, translated this, and he shared it with me yesterday, and it was so perfect, I had to include it here. He, the Tiferet Shlomo, this Hasidic Rebbe, is commenting on our verse, asking the question about why the verse says, Bitocham, and I shall dwell amongst them. And the question the Tiferet Shlomo asks is the following. Many commentators discuss the issue with why it talks about within them, Bitocham, as opposed to within it, Bitocho, or between, in a particular person. For me, the Tiferet Shlomo, this all rests upon the essence of how God's presence dwells among us. To me, it's all based on the inner workings of a person's offering through their speech. For they would consecrate, right, using this word mikadesh, even through their words to the sanctity of the tabernacle. The presence of God would then dwell based on that intention. For this reason, the Torah writes, V'shechanti betocham, I will dwell within them. That is to say, within the essence of the hearts of the givers, right? Referring to our first verse, these people who are giving Terumah, that from this we learn the great strength of speech, which is to say that that speech is one of the ways that we give generously, is one of the ways that we do this interaction. And so if we pull all of these ideas together, I think we end up with a profound statement of our role in reality, which is to say, when we speak, as we've learned from this quantum physics theory and from the verse in Genesis, when we speak, we create reality. When we interact with other people, we create reality. And so I imagine how we might change our actions with that knowledge. How we might actually understand that when we act and speak kindness, we are creating kindness, very literally, right? Not figuratively, but literally, we are creating kindness. When we act and speak generously, we are creating the generosity in a very literal way. When we act and speak forgiveness, we are creating forgiveness. And we can keep going, right? The negative is also true, right? When we speak anger and frustration and act on hatred, we also create those things. And so when we think about the implications of every action that we take, well, it's not just, I had a bad day and I'm frustrated and I yelled at somebody. I'm actually creating reality with that. And I think for me, it's encouraging, it's inspiring for me to think then, how might I act in every circumstance? How can I bring myself a presence of intention to say, how can I be kind in this moment? How can I be generous? How can I be forgiving? Right? Using this overlay of Terumah and holiness and Yom Kippur all rolled in together. That's where I'm going to leave. That's where my understanding of this week's parsha. And I want to invite you to share what you think. You can add it in the chat, but I would also invite you, if you would like to raise your hand and participate verbally, we'd love to have you do that. There is a raised hand function under reactions at the bottom. I invite you to raise your hand, and Julie will help me call on people. I want to point out something that Karen asked, which I thought was really interesting, right? It seems that it's not words, but actions that have the implication. And I want to argue that it's not an either or, it's a both and. That it's not just our actions, but it's also our words, right? That these things are sitting together. I know that Susan raised her hand very early on. We'll go to Susan, to Tanya, and then I see Esther raising her hand in the screen.
Susan's hand may have been raised for another thing, but let's see. Susan, did you want to say something? I think it was raised from a previous question you had asked. Cool. So let's move on to Tanya.
Okay, Rabbi, to me, the Mishkan represents a tikkun olam, which is a repairing of a relationship. And I don't think since the Garden of Eden, man and God had that relationship together. And so I feel like, you know, God created the world for man, but this was man's opportunity in the creation of the Mishkan to create a world for God. And, you know, you really can't have a virtual marriage. You just have to live together and live in the same place and dwell together. It's really hard to be married long distance. So really the Mishkan was almost like a recreation of the Sinai experience.
Yeah, I mean, powerful words. I mean, having been in long distance relationships, it's not the same when you're in the same place. Like it really makes a really big difference. And I mean, clearly the word mishkan and the verb to dwell sit together, right? And overlaid with this sense of holiness and relationship and connection. I think that's exactly right. Thank you, Tanya. I think it's Esther, and then we'll go to Nina.
Esther.
Westelman.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, I have two comments. One was about Terumah. To me, Terumah is a gift that is an overchanging. So if you do a gift, it kind of follows one after the other, which is very important. And also what I like that it's an opportunity for everybody to participate. And God the Torah doesn't tell us how much each one of us gave. So I like that idea that it's anonymous. And on the word betocham, I look at it as in each and every one of us. And I look at my Shabbat table as my Mishkan. And so like I explained to the kids, my candlesticks are from silver because it doesn't tarnish. So our religion, our belief is constant. And then the gold is something that doesn't tarnish. So this is our Torah. And then we have the wine and the bread at the Shabbat table. So to me, the bread is always fresh, and the wine, the older it is, the better it is.
Wonderful. Thank you, Esther. I love that imagery that you started with, right? This sort of how one thing leads to the next, right? Mitzvah goreret mitzvah, right? Each mitzvah, each thing leads to the next. I really love that image. Thank you for adding it. Nina, please. And then forgive me if I say it, Roni, you'll be next.
Sure. Thank you for this teaching. It's been really beautiful and resonates a lot. And I put a comment in the chat about the role of speech when you have a loved one for whom speech is kind of a core challenge and struggle. But what's been illuminating and kind of beautiful about that is having to be really intentional about speech and answering questions about language reminds you of like he will ask questions like, what does creativity mean? What is imagination? What you fill in any kind of question. And it reminds you how much we take for granted about the role of speech in human relationships. And it's a very humbling experience, but it's a hugely important one. And I think there's a kind of purity linked to this idea of holiness that derives from dealing with someone who doesn't take language for granted and really works to kind of excavate meaning in a way that forces the person on the other side of that relationship to excavate it as well. And that, I think, is an incredibly creative and creation-making process. And I think those of us who are neurotypical, for whatever that means, don't really experience that. We take that all for granted. And I think the pausing, the seeing differently, the seeing for the first time, and the seeing through someone else's eyes and experience and ears as well is maybe the most resonant thing for me, linked to what you've been discussing. It's really being able to be inside that creative process with someone who can't navigate it without the relational assistance. So I'll just leave it there. And thank you so much. It's been a beautiful teaching session.
Thank you so much, Nina. And I want to just draw out something really, I mean, so much of what you said, but right, that we use the word speech or other forms of communication very flippantly. And I think to your point, I don't think we're only speaking about literal words that are coming out of mouth right. God doesn't necessarily have a mouth. We don't know what those words were that God is communicating. And in my work as a consultant around communications, I usually use the word communications to be this catch-all term for all the different ways that we communicate. That is in part, someone has said before, actions and words being sort of interchangeable on some level. And so I want to sort of draw out the many ways that we communicate. I'm sure scientists have said, and I've read the statistic before, that the vast majority of our communications are not done verbally, but through body language and other forms and tone of voice. And so I want to just sort of draw out that point that, I think we should be inclusive of all forms of communication as a piece of this puzzle, right? We're not just talking about literal speech. So thank you for that. Roni.
Hey, thank you. Esther touched on my point with Betocham, but is there any Torah commentary that would support that it was not on the plural Israelites, Hebrew people, but rather in the individual, that God dwells within the individual plurality of having two spirits within us, so to speak, where I'll give you a quick example to juxtapose that is like in the Sim Shalom prayer, we say Aleinu and Al Kol Israel, implying that Aleinu, that we might be two, or, that we might have that duality, and then Tucham is saying that God's presence is dwelling inside both of us, so to speak. I know it doesn't quite make sense in English.
No, I'm with you. I have to imagine there are texts that speak in that with that construction, and I don't think it's a mutually exclusive, right? Like, I think bitocham can certainly mean, each of us individually together, right? Like when we daven, when we do prayer, certainly in the Jewish tradition, right? We're sort of all doing our own thing, but next to someone, right? And so I think that imagery is absolutely present here as well. So I think that's very resonant. So thank you. Yeah, Wendy.
Thank you, Rabbi. I have a question that's just a slightly different topic, and I joined a little bit late, so I really apologize if you've mentioned this, but when you were talking about quantum theory, I heard last year, for the first time ever, an idea that possibly what the Israelites had built with the Mishkan was an electrical circuit with a battery, with all the different metals and the specific placement of that, and that might have then led to all of this smoke and fire and things that were happening later. Have you heard any of this ever before?
We didn't learn a lot of electrical engineering in rabbinical school, so I can't speak with any real authority, and neither would I say I'm any expert around quantum physics or anything like that. But I think that's a really wonderful image. I think for my own particular persuasion, right? I try not to read Torah very literally, right? That there are elements of truth in every verse. But that being said, I love that image that they've really constructed something that perhaps we only rediscovered, millennia later. I think that's a cool visual. And so I don't know if it's true or not, but I think that's pretty awesome.
Thanks. Yeah, there's just so many different metals being described, and they're so specific that it just reminded me of, like, oh my gosh, this, and then when I heard it, that this may actually be a battery and an electrical circuit. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think it's great. Thank you for asking. Don, please.
It seems to me that in the Garden of Eden, God was present to Adam and Eve, and there was a closeness. When they left the Garden of Eden, that closeness was broken. So I see the Mishkan, or the tabernacle, as a reestablishment of the closeness of God with God's people, almost like a new Garden of Eden. And someone was mentioning about colors and metals. The elements used in the temple and in the tabernacle are highly symbolic of biblical history. The uses of those metals and the uses of the curtains and the blue threads and the altars. And so I see the tabernacle as being a way that God is reestablishing contact and seeking a relationship with God's people after they have left Egypt as slaves.
Great. Thank you for adding that, Don. I mean, I think there are one of the beautiful things that we learn, certainly in the rabbinic tradition, right, is this idea that there are 70 faces. There are many ways to learn Torah, and so I found it resonates what you're saying, right? This symbolic nature. Erica, a familiar face, please.
Yes, hello, Rabbi. Nice to see you. But just to follow on what Don said, I mean, and I loved what Tanya said too about the relationship and having to be present. And I apologize, I was late because I was at a different work seminar. But and weren't we also following this cloud that's through the desert that was telling us where to go? I mean, not we, but and so wasn't that also God being with us in a way? A different, and again, why should it be the same way? How can God be with us in many different ways? I'll say I reckon, the thing I like about yoga and the namaste is I recognize the divine in you. And I very much believe that all people have the opportunity or the possibility of having divinity, of doing something, you do a mitzvah, you think kind, that's the divine helping and creating something. So I feel like, so in that sense, yes, so God was helping us get through the desert also, but I do like the sense that it's this home for God. So because we also need we like grave markers in our civilization, that we believe it's important to have a place to mark where somebody is or was. So, and that's something that gives many of us comfort. Other people don't need to have that visible marker. They say they're with me anyway. So I think it's also just a question of where you want to find God, if God is there, or where God is saying, here, hineni, here I am. I'm here in this mountain giving you the commandments, or I'm here in this cloud that you're following, or I'm here in this Mishkan.
Yeah, it makes me think in some sense, right, of what's called negative theology. I don't know if people are familiar with that term. It's ascribed to the Rambam, although probably not exclusively, where the Rambam says, or Maimonides says, that any moment in which we have described the divine, we have limited the divine, that we've unfairly described God by saying God is something that God is not exclusively that. And that negative theology argues that the only thing we could say is what God isn't, right? So that God is not the chair itself. And I think part of that, and maybe this is just the way I read Torah, and the fact that, each of us have our own relationship or non-relationship with the divine, again, not ascribing a particular theology to anybody, but that the Torah describes many ways in which we interact with God, both personally and impersonally. We find in the very beginning in creation, right, that God is breathing in life into human beings. And I'm not sure there could be a more intimate relationship you can have with God than God giving you life upon taking first breath. And so I think as we explore, the many ways that God shows up in Torah and in Tanakh, I think each of them speak to every one of us in different ways. I always find the dichotomy. It's a little early for us to be talking about Shavuot, but I always love the dichotomy on Shavuot of this sort of God, with lightning and thunder and all of these sounds on top of Mount Sinai, this experience that we're hearing about in Torah right now, with the still small voice that shows up later in the tradition. And in I'm pretty sure it's Isaiah, that these two things live, that they're both true. And perhaps God is speaking to us in different ways at different moments and in different mediums, right? That there are those who believe that God is this very, natural force in the universe. And there are those who believe in a very deeply personal God. And I don't think either of those is right or wrong. I mean, that's just part of how each of us interact with divinity and holiness. Any other thoughts here that I'd love to add? Somebody who hasn't gotten a chance to speak yet today. Yeah, I see Joel waving in there. It's hard to see in the camera if everybody's waving. But yeah, Joel, go for it.
It's interesting to me that you bring up that it says that God through the Mishkan wants to dwell among us. And then you bring up quantum physics of space and time. But God doesn't exist in space and time. But the human condition, we cannot perceive something that doesn't exist in time and space. But we're in the Mishkan, but we're with something that doesn't exist in time and space. Could you comment on this?
Yeah, so I think that's a really fascinating thought. And so I think just sort of off the top of my head, this is how I would I think about this. I think you're right in the sense that certainly in the book of Genesis in Bereshit, we see this divinity existing outside the universe, right? There's the classic Zohar explanation of God having to do tzimtzum, of creating space within God's self for the universe to exist at all. And so seeing God as outside of that universe being a big piece of that. And to your point, we do in fact live in the universe. And so I think part of what, again, no expert in quantum physics, I think what we can learn from that, and what we learn, I guess, in other parts of the tradition as well, is that we are, and I think the tradition speaks to this, co-creators of the universe with God who is outside of the universe. And so that relationship, that dynamic is represented constantly and consistent, that every act and every way we interact is in part the co-creation with this existence that is outside, right? We don't know what is beyond the edge of the universe. We can only hope that perhaps God is there as well. I think we'll end it there. Certainly food for thought as we enter Shabbat, and maybe with one last act, I would invite everyone. We'll take another minute and thinking about this way that we can create kindness and goodness in the universe. I'd love for everybody just to describe one thing they're going to do either before Shabbat or the next few days, over the weekend, or the next week, of a way that they are going to co-create goodness in the universe. And so just add that in the chat. Just one thing. It could be a word, it could be a phrase, it could be a sentence. I won't hold anybody to their commitment, but just something that they could do to create, make a more universe a better place. Ooh, having patience, calling a friend, calling someone who's homebound, right? To be honest, invite a friend to go on a walk, right? Thanking your rabbi loudly for having services tonight. You should always thank your rabbi loudly. I can't argue with that one. Right? Talking to people, teaching people, right? Greet everybody cheerfully. I love these. These are just, the world is such a better place with all of these actions. To listen, to take someone to the store, help someone get food for themselves, right? Interact with children in the hospital. Amazing, amazing. Saying thank you, gratitude, so powerful. To be more trusting, right? To help people with food in the food bank, show up to services, kindness. Well, this is a wonderful list of good things. I just keep scrolling. There's so many things. It's hard to even say them all out loud. I love it. So thank you so much, everybody, for making the world a better place. And I hope all of you have a great and wonderful and meaningful and holy Shabbat. Shabbat shalom, everybody.